Okay, we have hope. Okay, so I just wanted to make an opening comment about how I fit into the overall class. It's helpful to realize that any illusion of coherence in this class is in fact an illusion because there's different people speaking and we have not colluded to figure out who's exactly going to say what. So I don't know if I will necessarily agree with what others say or they'll agree with me, but basically you want to understand that we're talking about literature in two parts. First, as a part of biblical revelation, those questions that relate to how does understanding the literary aspects of the Bible help us to understand it better, and those kinds of questions. I think there are 3 talks on this topic this quarter. And then there's that other aspect, which is the question of literature in the life of faith. I mean, the life of a person who is trying to live in the light of biblical worldview. Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know. And most of the talks are going to be about that. A person seeking to live in the light of the Bible, how would they relate to literature and what role could it play in their life and so forth. So in a way, there's kind of a split. They're somewhat related to each other, but I am very much concerned with the question of how understanding some of the literary aspects of the Bible would affect how we read it. What I'm about to say here might seem very rudimentary, and I guess it is, but it is very important to the way I think about reading the Bible, and so if you want to understand where I'm coming from, my starting place in trying to understand what the Bible is communicating to us is that the Bible communicates to us in ordinary human language, and that's what makes it possible for us to understand it. I mean, God is communicating to us in the Bible in the same way that I am communicating to you now, or you would communicate to me. We know how to do that. We understand what is involved in taking someone's words and trying to put them together. So I have a knowledge of the grammar of my language. I might not be able to articulate that knowledge, but I know it. I mean, I can tell when someone's talking to me. If Tim hit Bob, I know which is which. I know who did what. And it's not because necessarily that I could tell you words like subject and direct object and that sort of thing, but I just through experience know that those things are so. That's what part of what makes it possible for us to read the Bible. Communication happens because we have background information in common, and that's what makes the Bible challenging at times, is I kind of have to catch up with what the readers of the biblical text knew, because the author is assuming they know certain things, and we have to work at trying to put ourselves where we know some of those things as well. Very important skill of reading in context, thinking about how this particular sentence relates to the ones that came before it and the ones that came after it, looking for a kind of a coherent flow of thought through the text. All of these things are things that we know how to do, but when it comes to a difficult text like the Bible, we kind of have to slow down and sometimes be self-conscious about, oh, right, I need to pay attention to those things. And so, one of the things that is also true about ordinary human language and the way we communicate with each other verbally is that we communicate often by using what I'm calling literary craft. And the issue of what that might mean, I don't want to spend much time on that. Definitions are always tough, and we could spend the whole evening trying to figure out exactly what we mean by literature. I mean something fairly broad here for the purposes of our discussion. Literature, it happens when an author is going beyond a simple recitation of facts or opinions. The author is deliberately shaping the material in some way. So, for instance, to use poetic verse structure or something like that is obviously a literary device. If I just tell you something's happening, that's a different sort of thing than to write a poem about that thing happening. The author might deliberately take a show, not tell sort of approach, where instead of articulating ideas and emotions and relationships, it is demonstrated through examples or metaphors or any number of things like that. The author might rearrange material. If I'm talking about something that happened, I have a million choices as to what I might choose to talk about and not talk about. And all of those choices are a conscious crafting that I'm doing of the material to accomplish the goals that I have in mind. So what I'm saying is that the biblical authors often consciously shape and craft their material to accomplish various ends. And to be good readers means that we try and pay attention to that. So the Bible is speaking with different voices, in a sense. Because there are different literary devices, different genres, and so on that the texts that make up the Bible have, and we want to learn to listen for those things, pay attention to those things, because they sometimes affect the meaning of the text and also the impact of the text on us emotionally and volitionally and all of that. Okay. So I want to start with a real obvious example of one literary aspect of the Bible. I have heard it said that 1/3 of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew poetry. Clearly a lot of it is. That has an effect. I mean, understanding what that is and paying attention to the way it affects us as we're reading is one of those things that makes for a good reader of the Bible. So here's a classic example of what we call parallelism, which is the fundamental aspect of Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry doesn't have rhyme. There's huge debates about whether there is any sort of metric structure to Hebrew poetry. I have several big books about that thick on my shelves that are debating all of those things. And in the end, when you go through it, at the end, you have very little confidence that they actually know whether there is or not. But what is clear to everyone is that the basic nature of Hebrew poetry is that you have 2 or 3 lines, usually 2, sometimes 3, that are joined together, and they are meant to work together in some ways. So, for example, in this example from Isaiah 1:3, an ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Okay, so what do we observe here? The first 2 lines is a classic sort of parallelism. Notice in the first line, the animal is an ox. In the second line, the animal is a donkey. In the first line, what the ox knows is its owner. That is, so if there were people coming, the ox would recognize that's the guy that I always see. That's the guy that I can trust. In the second one, the donkey knows its master's manger. So it's not the master that we're concerned with here, but the fact that the master has provided this place of refuge, and the donkey knows about that. So if you take those 2 lines together, we have 2 examples of animals who understand, they know the owner and the master's manger. That is, they know who it is who is on their side, who is their protector, who is their provider, and so on. So those 2 lines together, you could paraphrase them as saying, even dumb animals know who's taking care of them, or something like that. But it's not better to paraphrase it that way, because the 2 lines actually have a power by giving these 2 individual examples. And the key to Hebrew poetry is the 2 of them work together. That you're thinking in your mind that there's something like each other in those lines, and so they kind of add up and make a fuller picture. So I think I could have had a third line that wasn't an ox and a donkey, but it could have been a dog or a cat or any number of things that would continue the same sort of pattern of thought. Okay, then secondly, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. So this is classic parallelism again. They do not know, they do not understand. Two ways of talking about very similar ideas. Here we refer to Israel once and my people another time. And so obviously the collective idea is that Israel are in fact the people of God. But that's really important in this context. It's not a casual sort of, he could have said, Israel does not know, the sons of Abraham do not understand, or, something like that. That would have been fine. But in this particular situation, the fact that it is God's people that Israel are being related to there is significant, because we also have a parallelism between the first two lines and the next two lines. That is, they are meant to work together. There is this contrast. The dumb animals know who's taking care of them. They know who they can trust. They know the one who is providing what they need. But Israel does not know. Israel should be much superior to the dumb animals in that they're human beings, and God is their God. He is their people. Yes. So, no, that's not right. He is their God. They are his people. That's what I was trying to say. So, there's a situation where you would really expect that they would understand who is on their side and the significance of that, because they are the people of God. And yet, where the ox and the donkey know who's taking care of them, the people of God do not know that God is the one who is taking care of them. So all of that is contained within, enhanced by the structure of the poetry in this regard. Well, this is a very, very common thing. This happens over and over and over again in the Old Testament. It happens in the Psalms. It happens in Proverbs. It happens a lot in the prophets and other places as well. Let me give you another example here. Isaiah 5:7. Now, the prelude to this is the song of the vineyard. God is telling this story about how, I planted this choice vineyard and I took care of it and I put up hedges to protect it and watered it, and I looked for good produce, good grapes from the vineyard, but I didn't get them. I got rotten stuff. So I'm angry at this vineyard, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tear down those hedges, and I'm just going to wreck the whole place, because what good is a vineyard that doesn't give you good grapes? And then this is the end of that story. This is where now the explanation for the little story about the vineyard is given. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. So we've had the story about this vineyard. Now he's essentially saying, and this is the metaphor. This is the analogy that I've been giving. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. I debate in my mind back and forth as to whether this is distinguishing Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern, or whether this is the house of Israel is just sort of one way of referring to Israel, and then Judah is narrowing in as to he's talking about Judah in particular, because that's who Isaiah was dealing with. I'm not sure. But either way, you can see how the two lines are working together. And so in the story, the vineyard owner was looking for good grapes, but he didn't get it. And now Isaiah explains the metaphor. Thus he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. And an interesting thing, part of the reason I chose this one, there's another reason that we'll see later on, but part of the reason I chose this one is that last line has a play on words in Hebrew that we don't see in the translation, but it's, thus he looked for mishpat, but behold, mispah. For tzedakah, but behold, tzedakah. So the two, righteousness and a cry of distress, are very close in the Hebrew words. Justice and bloodshed are very close in the Hebrew. So it's a very obvious play on words that's happening in that spot. Again, which just sort of enhances the power of the contrast that is being made. It's not just, we might contrast, there are many, I like poetry a lot, and there are some poems that have very little that they're trying to accomplish beyond delighting me aesthetically. And that's not really doesn't ever seem to be the focus of the literature of the Bible. The aesthetic delight aspect is there, but it is always kind of serving the purpose of enhancing and building up the idea or the emotion or the choice that I face or whatever that thing might be. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that happens in Hebrew poetry. Typically 2 lines, like I say, sometimes 3 lines. It's not that there's a rule that it has to happen exactly one way or the other. If you read about Hebrew poetry, there are many attempts to kind of break down the different categories. Well, there is synonymous parallelism and antithetical parallelism and synthetic parallelism and emblematic parallelism and all that kind of stuff. It's just kind of an attempt to notice that these lines relate to each other in a number of different ways. But that relationship between the lines and how the 2 lines work together to build a bigger picture in my mind, that's how Hebrew poetry works. Okay, so my first point basically is that the poetry is a common feature of the Old Testament. It helps to stimulate us both intellectually and emotionally. It has all kinds of impact on what we're thinking and feeling as we're exploring these ideas. And so one thing that is helpful to do is just come to recognize that here, for example, is a way in which literary craft is being used by the biblical authors, and it is an enhancement to my understanding and appreciation of the Bible to kind of slow down and learn to recognize that that's the case. Okay, there's another, there are all kinds of things that are related to this. I want to talk about another example of Hebrew poetry. Going to the book of Job. The book of Job starts out as just a narrative, a story. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him, etc., etc., etc. It's just a story, what we would call prose. It's just telling what's going on. The end of that prose is the very beginning of chapter 3 that says afterward, because you probably all know what happens in Job, God agrees to let Satan beat up on Job real bad, and he loses his family and his possessions, and all kinds of terrible things happen to him. And so, after all this terrible stuff happens, chapter 3 begins, afterward Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth, which is, again, a nice prose statement about what's going on. And then, we read this. Job begins to speak. Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. And then there's a little more, and then it says, as for that night, he said, may that day be darkness, the day on which he was born. And as for that night, the night which said, a boy is conceived, let darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. So, when Job starts to speak, he is speaking in poetry. It is Hebrew parallelism, elaborate metaphors, beautiful pictures of despair. This is poetry to the max. Let the stars of its twilight be darkened. We're still talking about the night he was conceived, I believe. Let it wait for light, but have none, and let it not see the breaking dawn, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb, or hide trouble from my eyes. Okay, let me highlight that last pairing there. This is a very, I think, typical and powerful sort of way that Hebrew poetry can work. Why is he cursing? He's cursing the day he was born and the night he was conceived. And why is it that he is, at this point, I think he's cursing the night that he was conceived? Because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb or hide trouble from my eyes. So the combination, see, if the opening of his mother's womb had been closed, then he wouldn't have been born, and he wouldn't have seen the trouble that his eyes have seen. So this is the first place. He's just been cursing and cursing and cursing the day he was born, the night he was conceived, and just these bad things for it, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb or hide trouble from my eyes. By being born, I became heir to a whole set of troubles that my eyes did not want to see. So that's why I would curse the day that I was conceived. Now, let's think about this. The book of Job now, you're probably aware that the book of Job has Job lamenting about this and thinking about God's involvement in this stuff. And then one of his friends comes along and rebukes him for his attitude and tells him, basically starts a defense of God. And then Job responds to him, and another friend comes in, and Job responds to him, and we go back and forth. And ultimately, this guy Elihu comes in that nobody knows who it is because he's never been in the story up to this point, and he says some stuff. And then God comes in and speaks to Job and says, I have a few things to say to you. Okay, that entire thing, entirely from beginning to end, is in Hebrew poetry. So what does that mean? Basically, we have a kind of a theological poem that Job gives, and then a friend gives a theological poem in response, and then Job responds to the friend with a theological poem, and then another friend chimes in with a theological poem, and at the end, God comes along and gives a theological poem, at which point Job says, I better shut up. And he does. So, few would argue, you may be familiar with Christians as we explore the question of the authority of the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible and those kinds of questions. A lot of times it's debated whether Job was intended to be presented to us as a real person. Was there actually a Job, or is this just a story like Jesus would tell a parable about the Good Samaritan or something? It doesn't mean that story actually happened. Likewise, are we saying that this story of Job actually happened? Well, if it did happen, if there was a real Job who went through these sufferings, and I think you could make a case that there was. I mean, I'm not here to make a case one way or another, but few would argue that Job and his friends actually spoke to each other in Hebrew poetry. That Job is suffering, he's lost his family, and he starts reciting this long poem about how he's unhappy. And then his friend comes along to rebuke him with another long poem about. That's probably not what happened. If there was a Job and his friends got on his case, it was probably not like that. So that means that the book of Job has been crafted by its author. This theological, highly charged theological discussion about suffering and God's responsibility for suffering and whether my own sin makes me worthy of suffering, and that's why I'm suffering, and all those sorts of questions. Those theological questions are being explored in poetry, in a poetic. I mean, what we saw here with Job. First, we had the statement, basically, he started to complain about the day he was born. And then we have this poetic description of, may the day be cursed and the light darken and all that stuff, which is emotional, it is artistic, it is crafted and structured. So that's what the author wanted to do. This author wanted to explore these highly important theological questions, highly emotionally charged for us as well, because we all face suffering and wonder, what's God doing? He chose to tell the story by using poetry to do it. What is poetry in their culture? So Does that mean that that settles it? Job is a fiction? I mean, as we all know, if we're, a lot of times people will say, well, is that literally true? And we say, no, it was just poetry. And what a lot of people mean by poetry is it wasn't true. It was fiction. Well, if you look at the Old Testament, there are all kinds of places where people are clearly describing other people and events that they believe really existed and things that really happened, and yet they use poetry to describe it. So the fact that it's poetry doesn't mean that it's not true, doesn't mean that the things didn't essentially happen. But what it does mean is that this author has created a highly crafted poetic reflection on the suffering of Job. So he has brought out, one could imagine that there really was a Job who faced these things, and he understood that God had put him through this stuff, and his friends were trying to convince him that was his fault. And ultimately, maybe even the revelation, God comes to him and explains to him, that you need to remember who you're dealing with here. I mean, all of that could be true, and yet the poetic structure of it is there, something that the author has given it to bring out what he thinks the significance is of the things that are happening in the story. So, like I say, I'm not here to argue for a particular view of Job, but clearly there's a great deal of artifice happening. There's a great deal of crafting and structuring and creating going on by the author that is not just a recounting of the literal events that happened. It's playing with that in a different way. Okay, so I'm still talking about Hebrew poetry, so why am I showing you an example from the New Testament? Let me read this to you and I'll tell you why. This is another way that understanding about something like Hebrew poetry, as which we're using for an example here of a literary aspect of the Bible, how understanding that can be helpful in the process of trying to sort out what is the Bible saying in different places. So this is in John 2:14. This is the casting out of the money changers. Jesus found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay. I just want to throw in a comment as we go by here. This translation makes it sound like Jesus took the whip and whipped the people who were there. I think the Greek makes it fairly clear that that's not what's happening. The whole point of the scourge is to drive the animals out. That he doesn't do it on the people, he does it on the animals. Okay, but what we're talking about here is his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay, so if I read that just by itself, I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like there was some statement in the Old Testament that says, "I will become obsessed with your house. Zeal for your house will consume me." We're familiar with that sort of construction where I'm consumed with jealousy, or I'm consumed with the plot of, what do people watch? Game of Thrones or something like that. It's like it has taken me over. That's all I think about. That's one way that this word could be used. But it is always, always, always important when a text in the New Testament quotes something in the Old Testament that you go back and actually look at the Old Testament passage that's being quoted. So, in this case, I'll give you a little chunk of Psalm 69, which is what's being quoted, starting in verse 9. "Because for your sake I have borne reproach. Dishonor has covered my face. I have become estranged from my brothers and an alien to my mother's sons. For zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me." Okay. So we have Hebrew parallelism here. Because for your sake I have borne reproach, dishonor has covered my face. This is a common sort of thing where one part of the first line is being worked with in the second line. I have borne reproach and dishonor has covered my face are the two things that are being compared. But both of them come under the reason for it. It is for your sake I have borne reproach. This is the psalmist, David, I'm pretty sure, saying to God, look, I've been on your team, and that's why people are beating me up. It is for your sake. It's not me. It's not that they don't like me. They don't like you. And that's why I have borne reproach, and dishonor has covered my face. I have become estranged from my brothers and an alien to my mother's sons. Notice that those two lines there are a classic sort of synonymous parallelism. I mean, those two lines, my brothers corresponds to my mother's sons, which obviously is two ways of exactly describing the exact same set of people. And I have become estranged from and an alien to. Those are, two different ways of describing very similar things. So there's a classic sort of parallel, synonymous parallelism at that spot. The next two lines, however, are interesting. They're a little more complicated, and we ask ourselves the question, what is the relationship between them? For zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. So here is the theme that we've seen in this whole little set of lines. In that last statement, the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. That's very similar to the for your sake I have borne reproach. It is, they don't like you, God, but I am the one who's getting it. So now, we come to the word consumed in the first line. The word consumed can be used in that sense of, I have been eaten up with this. I am just so preoccupied. So zeal for your house has become my preoccupation. That's possible. But the word consumed here is often used in the sense more like destroyed. That what consuming is what you do to your enemies. You consume them, which means, you take them in, it's your way of doing them in. So if we think about that possibility, zeal for your house has destroyed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. In the parallelism, they would both be saying, it is because of you, my connection with you, that I have received suffering. I have been zealous for your house, for your house. It is your house that I have been zealous for, and it has destroyed me. Because the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. If I had just not been zealous for your house, everybody would have left me alone. But because I was zealous for your house, all those people who don't like you have consumed me, have destroyed me. Now, is it possible I'm wrong about that way of taking it? Yeah. I'm not going to try to convince you that that's the case necessarily, but I would say that at least that is a very live interpretive option for understanding what's happening there. And it's because I know something about Hebrew parallelism that thought comes to my mind, as I'm trying to find a way of relating these two things, plus thinking about the Hebrew word involved. And in John, where the disciples are remembering this verse then, when Jesus casts out the money changers, they're not remembering a line about someone who was really, really preoccupied with zeal for God's house. They're remembering a line about someone who was destroyed because of their zeal for God's house. And if you think about it, that would be a very natural thing for them to be thinking about, because Jesus has just done a very scary thing. I mean, this is a volatile political climate, and he has gone in and cast out the money changers, and the Jewish leaders are coming to him and saying, what are you doing? By what authority are you doing this thing? And remember, the interesting thing that Jesus says is, well, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. In other words, and what he meant, they came to realize afterwards, is kill me and I will rise again. Well, so the disciples are thinking, man, you can get in real trouble for having this kind of zeal for God's house. And then they say, the leaders say, so what sign do you show me? And Jesus says essentially, kill me and I will rise again. And that is what happens. They kill him and he rises again. So the whole thing hangs together really well. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense. Could I be wrong? Yeah. I mean, I recognize there are choices to be made there, but I'm saying that knowing about the structure, knowing about parallelism and how that sort of thing works, can help you to recognize certain things and start to create possibilities for what might be being said there that might not have occurred to you otherwise. And I'll point out again, it would certainly not occur to you if you don't go back and look at the Old Testament passage to see what was going on. Okay, so, oh yeah, right. I'm going to move on from Hebrew poetry now. I want to talk about the evangelists as literary craftsmen. By the evangelists, I mean Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This one, well, I hope I can make this clear. Let me start, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but let me start by talking about something that we observe in the Gospel of John. And this is the relationship of Jesus chronologically to the city of Jerusalem. What happens in John is that we see Jesus in Galilee, and then he goes to Jerusalem for the Passover, and then he leaves through Samaria, famous story of the Samaritan woman at the well, and goes back to Galilee. Then he goes back to Jerusalem again for some feast. It doesn't say which one. And then he goes back to Galilee, and then he goes to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths. And I ran out of space, so I just put etc. But it keeps going this way, back and forth. Galilee, Jerusalem, Galilee, Jerusalem. Usually, I mean, you get the impression from the Gospel of John that Jesus went to like each one of the major festivals. So that would be at least like 3 times a year that he is traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem. And I might say that the picture that emerges from this is the first time he's there in Jerusalem at the Passover. This is where we have the cleansing of the temple thing that we were just looking at. That doesn't make him a lot of friends in Jerusalem. The next time he comes back in chapter 5, he heals a man on the Sabbath. And then he talks about how God is his father, and the Jewish leaders are incensed that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and incensed that he's referring to God as his father, and they resolve that they need to kill him. So this is in chapter 5 of John. Then in chapter 7, when he goes back, at this point, this is, if I remember correctly, this is where he tells his brothers, well, I'm not going to go. But then he does go kind of secretly. Because at this point, people are still talking about how he healed the guy and on the Sabbath, and how the leaders are trying to kill him. And Jesus knows that he's in trouble in Jerusalem, so he's kind of maneuvering around quietly behind the scenes, every now and again making a big public pronouncement. Towards the end of the book, when he knows that Lazarus has died, and he's going to go back to Jerusalem to raise Lazarus from the dead, the disciples are saying to him, you know, they want to kill you there. I mean, we have this history that has been developing. Each time he goes back, he gets in more trouble. And at the end, Thomas, who we call Doubting Thomas unfairly, I think, but he does one of the most admirable things that the apostles do in the Gospels, it seems to me. When Jesus says that I'm going to go and take care of Lazarus, he says to the other apostles, let's go and die with him. I mean, because they expect, this is a dangerous place. you could get arrested and killed. And they're not wrong about that, because when he goes, he gets arrested and killed. So the Gospel of John is giving this sort of progressive picture of a number of visits to Jerusalem that sort of accelerate the trouble that Jesus is in each time. It's kind of worse and worse. Now, I would say, I have great confidence in the truth of what the biblical authors are saying. I don't see of any way of understanding the Gospel of John that does not involve that's what actually happened. That is, Jesus went back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem a number of times, and each time he did something that made it worse from the time there before, which culminated in what happened in the crucifixion. Now, in contrast, the Gospel of Matthew, part of the reason I've been thinking about this is that I go through the Gospel of John each year with the students here in the microclass, and I have been teaching the Gospel of Matthew in my church for, it must be 30 or 40 years at this point, I think. So thinking about Matthew and John at the same time has been a very interesting process, because they are two very different sorts of books about the same events, about the same guy. So in the Gospel of Matthew, which is essentially the same as the other synoptic, so it's the same as in Mark and in Luke, the first part of the book just stays in Galilee. It doesn't really talk about Jesus traveling back and forth to Jerusalem. There's a little bit in Luke, but in Matthew, we have him in Galilee. All three of the synoptic Gospels have this turning point where all three of the synoptic Gospels have this turning point where Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? And then, who do you say I am? And Peter gives his confession, you are the Christ, the Son of God. A very important moment in those Gospels. And at that point, as Luke puts it, then Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem. And the next part of the book is the travel to Jerusalem, where when he gets there, he gets in trouble and is crucified and rise again. So the structure of the Synoptic Gospels, and Matthew in particular, is very, very different in the way it presents Jesus' life than the Gospel of John is. Now, if John is right, and I think that's the right way to understand what John is saying, and that he is indeed speaking truthfully about what happened, then the only way to understand what's happening here is that the synoptic gospel writers have reshaped the material. They're not telling a falsehood. They're not saying Jesus he only traveled to Jerusalem once. They're not saying that. But they're choosing not to talk about this back and forth that John talks about. Instead, they have organized the material in such a way that thematically the story of the gospel is Jesus starts out in Galilee, which Matthew makes clear right from the beginning is a no-place, podunk little place that you wouldn't expect the Messiah to be. And Jesus is in Galilee, he's a carpenter, he has this ministry, and then ultimately upon the confession of his disciples, he turns his face to Jerusalem, goes to Jerusalem, and it is there in his encounter with the religious leaders of Judaism at the center of the Jewish faith in Jerusalem, he is rejected and killed. That's the truth. That picture that Matthew is presenting is a true description of the arc of Jesus' story. It's not a detailed chronological picture of how did he travel back and forth, then how did he get in trouble, and those sorts of things. But he has crafted the story in such a way that he has brought out certain aspects of what's happening there. So I would say that both John and Matthew are telling the truth, but they have each, however, chosen to bring out certain themes by what they include and how they order it. Likewise, really quickly, you probably, or you may be familiar, that Matthew has 5 discourses, places in the text where Jesus gives an extended body of teaching. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount, then the sending out of the 12 disciples to minister, then a collection of kingdom parables, like the parable of the sower and the parable of the mustard seed, and like that. There's a fourth where he's talking about the relationship of disciple to disciple, how we ought to consider other disciples, and then finally the Olivet Discourse where he's talking about the future. And Matthew seems to have very self-consciously, he's aware that he has put these discourses together. Each of them have certain literary indicators on them that kind of say, yeah, here's another one of those discourses. Yeah, here's another one of those discourses. So Matthew knows what he's doing there. What I wanted to point out is the one that I have been looking at here recently and that I'm going to finish talking about this Sunday at my church, the discourse on the sending of the disciples. Matthew has collected material found in 4 places in Luke. Luke talks about a sending out of the 12, and some of the material in Matthew comes from there. Luke talks about a later sending out of 70 disciples, and some of the material in Matthew comes from there. There are the final instructions that Jesus gives about what's going to happen to the disciples after he leaves. When he sends out the apostles, how they're going to be dragged before the Gentiles and kings, and they're going to have to give an account of things and so on. And then there are general teachings just on the cost of being a disciple of Jesus, and in particular how you're going to get in trouble with people that don't like Jesus. Those teachings are in different places in Luke. Well, what's the explanation for that? I mean, there are a lot of different possibilities, but one distinct possibility is that Matthew has collected together teachings that he believes to be related. That he says, this is what Jesus tells his disciples, and he uses this occasion of the sending out of the 12 to gather together material that is all essentially about the same thing, which is how you're going to represent me, and people are not going to like you because they don't like me. And that's kind of the theme that runs through the whole thing, even though it's quite possible that the specific things that Jesus said, some of them he said on this occasion, some of them he said on this occasion, and so on. Again, it makes it look quite possible, and it fits with other things that we see in Matthew, that Matthew is deliberately shaping and structuring the material to bring out certain things. Now, is he misrepresenting Jesus? I would say no. I mean, can you imagine that you might want to tell the story of there's some interesting person that you know, and probably the way you might choose to tell it would not be to go chronologically through each time that you met that person and what they did. You would probably think about, one of the things about that person is that person has a great sense of humor. And so you would gather those events from different occasions and kind of put them in together into, his comedic monologue or something like that. The only thing that's misleading about that is if somebody misunderstands you to be saying this one occasion he gave this big monologue, if you see what I'm saying. I mean, but otherwise, you're giving an accurate picture of this person. In fact, by gathering those things together, you have brought out some things that might not have been apparent. You're saying, I have looked at the story. I was there, and I think that these things go together because they tell us something. But see, that's craft. That is literary structuring of the material. This is an author saying, I want to bring out meaning by choosing what I am going to talk about and what I'm not going to talk about and putting them together in such a way that the relationships become clearer. So, in general, it seems to me to be true that Matthew is using literary craft to bring out important themes in Jesus' teaching. And I just want to reiterate, I have a very high view of the authority of the Bible. I would argue for what people call the inerrancy of the Bible, and that's a long topic. But But I don't see any conflict between that and what I'm saying here, because choosing how I am going to shape material to give what I think is an accurate picture of what I understand to be going on, that's a truth-telling operation. And it doesn't have to be that if I gather things together that I have somehow distorted it out of recognition. I might have. I can do that. It's possible to take material and give a very wrong impression of someone by putting together things and implying that they went together when they don't go together. But that's not, at heart, it doesn't have to be that way. But what has become clear to me, and this was not, when I was a young person very interested in studying the Bible and understanding the Bible better, I would have put a lot of emphasis on like the letters of Paul, where Paul is making some theological argument. Here's point 1 and here's point 2 and so on. And I think I would have seen that as kind of, that's the pinnacle of what the Bible is and ought to be, is making rational arguments for theological points, that kind of thing. Well, that's a great thing to do, but what I'm seeing more and more over the years as I'm looking at these things is that there is a lot of literary craftsmanship going on in the texts of the Bible, where the author is using those tools to try to bring out what seems to the author to be the abiding, significant aspects of what it is that we're looking at. And part of what it means for, excuse me, part of what it means for the Bible to be inspired then is that the biblical authors have a God-inspired understanding of the situation such that when they present, this is what I think is significant, they're right. It is significant. Okay, so make a quick comment about John then. John is very different. The Gospel of John is very different from the Synoptic Gospels, the other three. And I'm not really going to go into all of this here, but if you go looking through the Gospel of John, you start to see that there are themes that emerge. And I'm become more and more convinced, the more I see those themes running through the text, that those themes, in fact, are the motivation for the aspects of the story that John has chosen to highlight, if you understand what I mean. There are certain stories that he's going to bring out. Or even when he tells a story that is one of the stories that is also in the Synoptic Gospels, and this doesn't happen very often, but every now and again it does, John always has a different spin on it. He has something that he puts in that seems to relate back to these themes that seem to be running through the text. I would argue that if you look in the Gospel of John, these are just a few things. There's so much that we can say about the structure of the Gospel of John. But I see running through the text discussions of miraculous signs as a ground for belief, the question of Jesus doing these signs and people responding by believing that he is the Messiah that he claims to be, and so on. We see Nathanael doing that. Nathanael is told about this guy from Nazareth, and he says, can any good thing come from Nazareth? And then Jesus does kind of an impressive, miraculous sort of thing, and Nathanael goes, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. Where he has moved from, you got to be kidding me, from Nazareth to, I believe, I'm there. And it's so interesting that Jesus' response to him is, oh, you believe because of that, huh? That's why you believe? Okay. Well, you're going to see some more interesting stuff than that after this. The story of the wedding at Cana. I mean, it's a miraculous sign, the turning the water to wine. But one of the things that's significant about it is at the end of the story, You know, most of the wedding guests don't really know that it even happened. It's the servants who kind of know in the background that this event happened, but somebody else who knows that it happened is Jesus' disciples who are there with him. So at the end of the story, it says his disciples believed in him because of the thing that he did. The woman at the well, he tells her all the stuff about her life that he wouldn't have had any way of knowing. And she goes back to town. No, this guy told me everything I've ever done, and raises the question of whether he's the Messiah. You think this could be the Messiah? Which brings us to the second theme that runs through John, testimony as a ground for belief. The woman at the well is a good example of that. Jesus tells her everything she'd ever done. She goes back and is telling people that she's seen the Messiah, and she tells them what he had done. And it says the people in the village believed in him because she comes and tells them what it is that Jesus had done. Then they go out and meet Jesus, and they talk to him, and it says afterwards the people said, now we believe in him, not because of what you said, but because we've seen him for ourselves. So they start out believing because of her testimony as to what she had seen, and then ultimately they believe because they actually experience him for themselves. So again, this theme of why you would believe and the role of testimony in that is one of the things that shows up in John. A lot in John about unbelief and how it relates to that unbelief is not just a thing that is, oh, I don't happen to believe that that's true, but in fact it is a matter of the will. It is, I am rejecting a truth that I do not want to know. And that shows up a lot in John. And at the end, we end up with John and the apostles' testimony as a ground for belief. And I think by the end of the book, it makes it clear that John all along has been thinking about, this is a fairly late book, and he is writing to people who did not know Jesus. They have never seen him. They didn't see the miracles. And John is emphasizing, I saw them. I'm an eyewitness. I can tell you that these things happened. And he has the famous statement at the end, therefore many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John is perceiving of himself and the other apostles as the ones who are providing testimony as to what Jesus did, and thus giving them the grounds for believing in him. Just before that statement, the last story that is told is the story about doubting Thomas. Jesus comes to all the other disciples. Thomas wasn't there. The disciples tell him that they saw Jesus, and Thomas says, unless I see it for myself, unless I put my finger in the nail holes and the tear in his side, I'm not going to buy that story. And then Jesus shows up, and Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And again, Jesus asks that question, oh, is that why you believe? Because you saw me? Blessed are those who haven't seen and believe. And I think, again, all of that is related to John's overall purpose, which is his recognition that as a late disciple, as he's writing later on, when people can no longer see Jesus or hear these things, that the belief that saves is going to be based on the testimony of those who have seen the signs that provide the ground for belief. And so the theme of signs, miracles, testimony, belief, and unbelief are central in the gospel, I think, because that's the concern that John has. And so it shapes what it is he wants to do. Okay. I do have one other thing to say, but I don't know. It's 10 after, so we have 20 minutes till we go to 8:30, right? Is that the event? I will submit to you. I will say one more thing, or we can take the next 20 minutes for questions and comments. Or I can talk, and then we'll have 5 or 10 minutes for questions or comments. Okay. You don't have to twist my arm to make me talk, as anyone who knows me will tell you. Why am I showing this one again? We just looked at this a little bit ago. We're talking about parables. I'm just reminding you there was the story of the vineyard. You guys can go ahead and come on in. Sit down. No problem. So, we had a story, Isaiah, a kind of a parable where God was pictured as planting a vineyard, but it didn't produce good grapes, and so in the end he's going to destroy the vineyard, and it ended with this statement that we looked at earlier. Now, jump ahead to Matthew 21:33, where Jesus is telling a parable. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. Okay, the part in capital letters there, planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower, that's from Isaiah. Those words are from the story, the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah. So anyone who knows the Old Testament would recognize when Jesus uses that language that he is borrowing the language from an earlier parable that Isaiah had told about how God planted a vineyard, but it didn't give him the grapes that he was looking for, so he was angry with it and destroyed it. But now notice here, in Jesus' parable, we have a twist on the Song of the Vineyard. The landowner plants this vineyard and does all of these things, but then he rents it out to vine growers and goes on a journey. So he rents it out to someone else. But afterward he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." Okay. So I lost. There's a spot in here. I was copying and pasting, and I evidently missed one, because there's a spot in here where he sends servants to get the produce from his vineyard, and they say no, won't do it. So afterward he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance." They took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Okay, so this story now has been enhanced. It is not that the vines are not producing good grapes. It is that the vineyard, the vine growers, the ones who are renting out this property, are not giving the produce to the vineyard owner that they owe him. And they ultimately end up killing his son rather than giving him the produce that they owe him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those wine growers? They said to him, "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons." So there are two literary things that I want to bring out here. First, Jesus has taken the story that people already know, but he has given it this twist. As I said, it's not that the vines aren't producing, it is that the vine growers are refusing to give the proper payment to the owner of the vineyard. So this parable is not about the people of Israel, as the Song of the Vineyard was in Isaiah. It is about the leadership of Israel. It is about those who are tending the vines. that the reason that there is no produce coming is not that the vines were bad, like it was in the Song of the Vineyard. It is that the vine growers are not doing what they're supposed to do. So this story it becomes apparent when you compare them that Jesus has angled it to be aiming right at the Pharisees and the leadership that he's talking to. The other thing that's interesting is the way this ends, particularly in Matthew. He tells this story and then asks the question, what will he do to those vine growers? And they give him an answer. They've followed this story. They're following along and saying, yeah, this is terrible. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. Of course. What else is he going to do? Well, this is very similar to, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but this is very similar to, if you remember the time when King David took Bathsheba and arranged for her husband to be killed, and the prophet Nathan comes to David and says, I have a story I want to tell you about there's this poor man and his family, and they have this one little lamb, and the rich man's going to have a banquet at his house, and he says, I need some more lamb, and he goes and grabs the lamb from the poor guy and takes it for himself. So David gets incensed and says, that guy, find that guy. He needs to be killed. I mean, that is terrible that he did that. And then Nathan says, you are the man. So in the situation, Nathan has told a story it is an understandable story from human experience, and it has an emotional impact to it. You hear that and say, there is an injustice being done here, and there's something not right about this. Well, that's what's happening in this story. Jesus tells this story about the vineyard owners the vineyard growers who kill the owner's son rather than pay what they owe him. And they get incensed and say, well, of course. And what needs to happen is he needs to get rid of those guys and bring in new guys. And it should be bad for them. And after a few other words, Jesus says, therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. So in essence, this is you are the man. I mean, what he's saying is, you know what you just said? That's right. That's what ought to happen. And that is what's going to happen. So, my 2 points here, there's a lot that could be said about parables as a form of communication, as a literary form, how Jesus uses them. This isn't the place for that. But what we see in this one example is he has told a story that has resonance with the people who are hearing it. It's understandable. They can feel what the emotions would be of the people involved in this scenario. And he's using that then as an analogy. You see what you're feeling there? You understand the injustice of this? Okay, I'm talking about you. Take that and bring it over here to what you have done. So the power in the story then, if he had just said to them, God doesn't like the way you're handling your responsibilities, okay, that would be a straightforward sort of declaration of his point. But by telling the story in this literary way, he has told a story that is understandable and engages people, engages their imagination, engages their will. I mean, they look at that and say, I know what I would choose in that situation, and so on. And thus the power of it comes from the fact that it is that kind of a crafted literary thing, that it's a kind of story that has a power beyond just the statement of the actual wrongs and grievances that God has with Israel. And then the other thing is that notice how an understanding of the earlier Song of the Vineyard helps to understand, for Jesus to make his point, that you can actually see that there is something. He has taken an existing idea and shaped it in a different way, because we're moving from the general problem of Israel as a people to the specific problem of the religious leaders of Israel, because that really is the target that Jesus takes on in his ministry. If you look at the Gospels, an awful lot of what he says is aimed at the way the Jewish leadership is exercising their religious responsibility to teach and guide Israel. So he has shaped his story in such a way to bring those things out. Okay, well, I have chosen tonight to give you various examples of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. I I chose not to try to sort of systematically lay out a theory or rationale for all of this. My point is that we can understand the Bible because we understand human communication. And part of human communication, part of human language involves things like metaphor and telling stories where certain themes are brought out by the way the stories are shaped, and using linguistic structures like poetry and that sort of thing to highlight and bring out certain emotions and all of that. All of that is a part of human communication, and all of that is a part of the way God is communicating to us through the biblical authors who are telling his story. So you probably didn't need convincing, but if you needed convincing, I hope I took at least one step toward convincing you that those are important issues to think about as we look at the Bible. Okay, so we have a few minutes if you have any comments or questions. Yes, I agree. It is disgusting for the speaker to blow his nose in front of everybody. Yeah.
Thou hast spoken plainly. Thy words are very clear. I thank thee for thy presentation. I'm grateful for thy teaching.
And that's a quote from something somewhere. Good. Thanks. I don't always arrive there, but being clear is always my main goal.
So thank you very much, Ron. That was a wonderful and stimulating talk. One of the things you mentioned several times was how literary artifice, whether in the form of John's or Matthew's kind of careful structuring of their telling of the gospel, or the poetry of the dialogues in Job, these things work to elicit certain emotions from the reader. You talked a lot about the emotional effect that literary artifice has, as well as a kind of intellectual understanding.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on why, because these are things worthy of these emotions. The meaning of these events that this literary structure brings out is there. It's inherent in the events. Why is it that it's necessary for these authors to use artifice? Why couldn't, let's just say that Job is a historical account, and why is poetry more appropriate than the language of prose? Why is prose not as effective in eliciting these emotions? Do we need literary artifice in order, in some ways, to feel and to think? Is literature, in some ways, an allowance for human frailty? Do we need poetry to kind of hit us over the head and say, this is worthy of poetry?
This is a poet asking this question. I would like you to understand. Well, I might say that in those examples it's more appropriate or more effective. I don't have to say that. I mean, I'm not down on prose. I'm not saying that there aren't. I think there are things to be said that are most powerful by simply saying them. So it's kind of it's a choice that the authors are making. Some of it, I think, relates to their understanding of the people that they're dealing with. That I assume. See, I mean, we're kind of culturally removed from something like the Gospels. We have to, in my own life, I feel like I have had to catch up with the fact that that's the sort of thing that's happening in the Gospels. And my initial study of the Gospels was kind of pull out little pieces and say, okay, what theological point is happening here? Which is not necessarily bad as long as you don't pull out of context. I don't mean that. But coming to recognize, we don't exactly tell theological stories the way the gospel writers are doing it. It's not exactly the way we would go about doing this thing. So some of it is culturally informed. That is, I assume that Matthew knows that by shaping it in this way, for the people that I'm dealing with, this is most likely to be helpful and bring out what it is I want to bring out. I suppose it goes back to, I just threw in that little phrase, show, don't tell, but I think there's a lot of power in that. I mean, writers, any book that you would pick up, if you're one of those people that wants to become a gazillionaire by writing movies or something like that, so here's how you write a movie script or something like that, the thing that they tell you is, exposition is the killer. You have these characters sitting there, you have 10 minutes of one person explaining to the other person what the situation is or something like that. It's like, so that it's much more interesting and engaging to, don't tell me that this person is sad, put them in a situation where I understand that I would feel that way. And it is bringing out something, it is making a connection with my experience of things that for some things that is the way that's best going to come out. So sometimes, I think sometimes it is better to come at things in such a way that my experience of human life will suggest to me what is at stake, or the kind of choice that I must make, or why that's a valuable thing and I ought to want to pursue it. I mean, for any of you who've heard me talk about the parables, I really think that's what the parables are, is they construct stories that make sense to us, that and we understand, somebody discovers there's this field. I don't know the field, but there's this huge treasure hidden in the field. Well, how would you feel? What would you do? What you would do is you would calmly bury it back in there, and you would take everything you've got and go to the person who owns the field and say, here, take everything I got. I want your field. This is understandable. I mean, we look at that and say, yeah, that's what you would do. And you also understand that, that would look stupid to a lot of people, that you would take everything you have and buy a field with it. What are you going to do? If you don't have anything left, you're going to go sit in your field? I mean, what is life going to be from then on? But you understand something about what that field contains, what it is that's going on there. Well, so I can hear that story and understand the motives and understand kind of the excitement of, yeah, I would do that thing. That it helps me to see how Jesus thinks about the value of what he's talking about. It's like that. Think about how you would feel in that situation and why you would be happy to give up everything you've got. Well, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something like that. So he can also say that that's true. What's the statement? It's gone out of my head. The thing about it's not worth gaining the world and losing your soul, or something like that. I don't know. I think my brain is gone. It's 8:30 and my right, that. So that's a statement of the truth that carries some. It is understandable in an emotional and volitional way. If I think about it, I can understand how a person would feel and why the person might make that choice in the story, and that supports the statement that, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? That's a powerful statement. It's true. The fact that it's baldly stated like that doesn't make it unpowerful, but the parable is a different kind of, it comes at it in a different way and arouses my thinking in a different way. If I'm willing to go there, if I'm willing to let it go there. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of dancing around your question, but okay, we should probably stop. Oh, thank you. I can cough more for you if you'd like.